The federal government doesn't have as much influence on the day-to-day lives as people might think, but the local government does. And so that's why there really needs to be good alignment between what's happening at the state level and what's happening in our local governments.
This is Real State, a podcast from CSG South. Join us as we talk with policymakers and public leaders shaping state-level decisions across the South and explore how ideas move from policy to real impact.
Hello, and welcome to Real State. I'm your host, Lindsey Gray. Across the South, state leaders are constantly evaluating how to deliver better outcomes for citizens while remaining responsible stewards of taxpayer resources. While much attention is often given to the policies states adopt, an equally important question is whether those policies ultimately achieve their intended goals. In Tennessee, those conversations have included government transparency, education funding, higher education governance, government accountability, and the long-term challenges of turning legislative action into measurable results. Our guest today is Senator Bo Watson of Tennessee. Senator Watson has served in the Tennessee Senate since 2006 and currently serves as chairman of the Senate Finance, Ways and Means Committee, and the Senate Rules Committee. Over nearly 2 decades in public service, he has helped shape many of Tennessee's most significant policy and budget decisions, while providing leadership on issues that affect communities across the volunteer state. Senator Watson, thank you for joining us today.
Well, Lindsey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about state government.
Well, you certainly are a pro, so I will jump in, Senator. You've had a front row seat to Tennessee's evolution over nearly 2 decades in public office. So looking back, when you first entered the Tennessee Senate in 2006, what are some of the biggest challenges you've seen in how state government operates and delivers services?
Well, initially, when I first got elected, states, one of the biggest challenges states had was just the financial side of things. It wasn't but a couple of years after my election that we ran into the 2008 the recession and the financial challenges. In 2010, when Governor Haslam became governor, we had to do a lot of financial reductions all across the board. But since then, states, particularly states in the South, have been really good about their budgeting and their financing, and things have been much, much better. It's allowed us to address some of the long-term challenges that southern states, particularly Tennessee, has had, like K-12 education. And perhaps no other state in the country has done more around K-12 education than Tennessee has.
Absolutely. I know you've been deep in that work over the years, and we will certainly jump into some policy that you've championed and been a part of in recent years. But I'm sure you have plenty of stories and lessons learned. So with nearly 20 years in public service, what lessons have most influenced the way you've approached public policy making today? Well,
every 2 years we have an election of a General Assembly, particularly in the House and half the Senate. At least that's the way it works here in Tennessee. And every 4 years we have a new governor. And one of the biggest lessons that I've learned about the legislative life is the challenge of long-term planning. Since, essentially the legislature, at least one half the legislature, the House, turns over every 2 years, keeping a consistent plan and strategy in place can be really, really challenging and difficult. The other thing that I've learned in my 20 years is that the people who serve in elected office in Tennessee state government really have the best interests of Tennessee at heart. We all have different ways of getting there, different viewpoints. Ultimately, we have to figure out how to work together, whether it's rural versus urban or Republican versus Democrat. But in state government, because we have balanced budgets, because we have limited time frames of which we're allowed to be in session and make laws, we really, unlike maybe our federal friends, we really have to figure out ways to work together in order to get things done. And we've been really successful at that in Tennessee over the past 10 or 15 years.
It's so interesting to watch and to see the differences between the federal and federal government, how it works, and then how our states work. And there's so many misnomers out there. I tell everybody, yes, the media wants you to believe that they don't get along and they're always at each other's throats, and that's just not the case. They may be fiercely debating on the floor, but they do know each other outside of this, see each other often, and have to get that work done for your state. So a lot of people have relationships beyond what you might see beyond the policy. So
I'd say that, when you're thinking about things that have influenced governing, influenced the way the legislature operates, certainly the rise of social media and its impact in the political space, where oftentimes members are trying to either avoid saying something or get somebody to say something so they can get that extra click or that extra attention on social media. I think that has created a little bit more performance politics than maybe existed when I first got elected, where individuals are sometimes more interested in the gotcha moment than they are in the governing moment. And we're learning to adjust to that. Again, states are different from the federal government in that we have limited time frames in which to work, and we don't have the option of not passing a budget. Now, some states can struggle. Like I know North Carolina spent probably an extra year trying to get their budget done. But at the end of the day, they have to do a budget. They have to operate within certain restraints that don't necessarily bind our federal government the same way.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, legislatures are often judged by the bills they pass, but governing doesn't stop when legislation becomes a law. As chairman of Finance, Ways and Means, you're often evaluating not just policy ideas, but whether those ideas actually produce results. So in your experience, what separates legislation that creates lasting results from legislation that may look good on paper, but struggles in implementation?
Well, sometimes you don't know until you start trying to execute some of the ideas or the laws that you've passed. I would like to think that, everything that we pass in the Tennessee legislature has functional purpose to it. But certainly there's some political messaging that we do. Ultimately, we try to the best of our ability to measure our legislative activity based on outcomes rather than on inputs. What I mean by that is that you can pass legislation that perhaps looks good back home and signs people up for something, but the outcome is never really realized. One example of that might be somewhere in the childcare space where maybe you pass a piece of legislation that looks really good and has a lot of people sign up, but then when you look at the outcomes of it, you're not getting either the educational results that you thought you were going to get, or even the participation from the community that you thought you were going to get. It is a challenge for state governments. We're smaller, obviously, than our federal partners, and we have a little bit harder time on follow-up. One of my, frustrations and desires is that we would do a better job about following up on the legislation that we've passed to be sure that 2 or 3 years later, we are measuring whether something has actually had its intended effect or not. But as you know, when it comes to governments starting programs or developing ideas, once created, they are very difficult to eliminate, even if they're not being successful. One way is that legislatures try to deal with that is by putting particular types of sunsets onto legislation. For example, you might pass a piece of legislation, say it's going to exist for the next 5 years. And if the legislature doesn't take affirming action, then that piece of legislation just goes away. Those kinds of legislation require future legislatures to look at and evaluate the program. We started out talking about one of the challenges that we have in the legislature is long-term planning and long-term strategy, because what's important to one legislature 2 or 3 years later might not be important to a future legislature or a future governor. And keeping some of these things that take years to affect. For example, when you do K-12 education reform, you may not know the outcomes of that reform for 12 years until a whole group of students have gone through the process. Well, if you are constantly having different reform ideas come before the legislature because you've got new people elected, new governors elected, if you don't stick to those strategy that was originally started, you never really know whether what you did worked or not. We've been fortunate here in Tennessee that we've had some consistency amongst legislative objectives and governors' objectives over the past 10 to 12 years, that we have seen some pretty dramatic improvements in our K-12 education program, not to mention the introduction of universal school choice, which has been a really big thing here in our state.
And I want to move to some of the policy that you have put forward and has recently passed. But before I do that, how should policymakers think about implementation and accountability when evaluating whether that policy has truly succeeded? Do you have any tips or tricks or things that you typically look at when evaluating?
You have to try and be objective. Obviously, we live in a political world, and political worlds do not always consider the facts and data. They often are more interested in the story that it tells or the impact that it has on people subjectively. And we talk a lot about objective data, but it's difficult sometimes to make decisions about objective data, because once you start a program, for example, and the objective data tells you that it's not having the effect or the impact that you thought it was going to have, it's incredibly difficult to stop doing that. I mean, you've got people whose jobs now may depend on that program. You've got people who are involved in the program that, think it's working for them, even though maybe overall it's not working. That's really difficult. And then, one legislature that passes something, a future legislature has to make the decision as to whether they're going to continue with it or not. And they may not fully understand why a previous legislature had put it in place. There's no magic answer to your question. I think it does require a certain amount of discipline amongst legislative leaders that if we are going to do a program where we're expecting results from that program, that we have the courage to either change or eliminate the program when it's no longer achieving its objectives. But that's, very, very difficult to do.
And you've put forward kind of transparency as one of those measurement tools that you've used. And an example of that philosophy can be found in legislation that you've sponsored this year focused on education spending transparency. And in 2026, you sponsored the Better Spending, Better Schools Act, SB 2072. And this legislation was designed to improve transparency and consistency in how education spending information is reported and understood across Tennessee. So what problem were you trying to solve with the Better Spending, Better Schools Act, and why did this issue rise to the level of legislative attention for you?
Education and health are the two biggest expenditures that state government has. And in Tennessee, it's usually education, particularly K-12 education. And so taxpayers are paying for all of that. And we need to look for ways to explain how money is being used that people who don't swim in the education space every day can understand. The bill isn't intended to say that we're not being transparent. All of the information that the bill seeks to provide to the public, it's available. It's publicly available. The problem is you have to have several postgraduate degrees in order to figure out where the data is housed. And so what we're hoping to do is create a format where taxpayers of any standing can go and look and see how their local government, how their local education agency is spending the tax dollars that is provided to them. For example, are the expenditures because of federal dollars, or are they because of state dollars, or are they coming from some other source? Simple things like that in a format that the general population can understand, as well as creating a public-facing platform on the website that researchers can easily find information on. We rely on a lot of third-party people looking at data, generating ideas, coming up with innovations, coming up with new ways of doing things, and making information, in the legislative world, information is power. And providing that information to people in a format that they can easily understand and not have to be some advanced academic, I think is good for the system. It gives, when the public can easily see the information, it builds trust. Mm-hmm. It also helps the government, helps the general population look at K-12 education and go, okay, this is worth the investment, or we need to do something different because this isn't paying off the way we thought it was going to pay, or challenge their local school system as to why they're spending money in a certain place. And then finally, we want to build a system that is consistent across platforms. So you don't want local education association in West Tennessee reporting data differently than the people in East Tennessee, because then researchers and the general public have a hard time making comparisons as to what's happening between these two school systems. So it's intended to try and bring standardization to the reporting process, and then also just simplify the reporting process. Now, we will not get this right the first time we do this. It will take us probably, you asked me earlier some of the things I've learned. And one of the things that I learned is that you rarely get things right the first time you do it. You might get it 80% of the way. But what we're going to do is put something out, and then we're going to get feedback from the public. Some of it will be positive, some of it will be negative, and we'll try to figure out and learn from that and try and craft. My goal is to craft an information delivery system that people can actually manipulate, look at, work with, understand, and it's easy, and it's much easier to read, and it's organized in a way that makes sense to people like you and me who, aren't necessarily academic statisticians or anything like that.
No, I'm not. You nailed that.
well, and people always, they always, because we spend so much money on education, it would make sense that we should try and figure out ways to explain it the best way we can to the people who are paying for it. Yeah. And, one of the things that we get criticized for here locally in Tennessee, as an example, is, we are ranked in 51st in education per pupil spending. And when you first say that, you're like, ooh, that kind of stings a little bit, right? But then you look and you compare our National Assessment of Education Progress against other states, and you realize that in my time in the legislature, we have gone from being ranked roughly 45th in reading and math performance on the NAEP to in the top 20 in reading and math performance in the United States. So the taxpayer can look and go, well, yeah, but we're actually getting a really good deal for the money that we're investing in our education system. And those are the types of analyses that the bill is trying to make easier for people to understand and people to see, to say, well, you know what, in Tennessee, they don't spend as much as they do in other states, but for what we spend, we actually get a really good result. And that means the reforms that we've put in place, the policies that we've put in place, are having their intended effect.
Yeah, and that transparency is so important in that just building trust with the general public and your constituents, but then also helping to inform decisions you all make as those folks, those researchers come together and they dive into this, and then they start providing that data to our legislators. As you mentioned, you have a lot of third parties that kind of come in and provide information for y'all that where it came from. That data is good. You trust that data as well. And so the long-term effects of that transparency, I imagine, will pay off. So if this legislation is successful, what decisions will policymakers be able to make differently because they have this better information?
Well, I hope that we will be able to make a decision of where's the best place to spend our money, and then comparing, financial information to results like National Assessment on Education Progress or other types of standardized testing. Is the money that we're spending getting the results that we are anticipating? And then are we doing some things that's coming to us through federal dollars that just don't fit within Tennessee's education system? And then you can communicate with the general public and say, look, here we've got the reason we're having to do this is because it's tied to this federal program which provides these federal dollars. Now, if you want us to quit doing that, we may be happy to do that, but understand we're not going to get these federal dollars for doing it. Or same way, a local education agency might go, this is why we're doing this. It's tied to these state dollars. If we don't have to do it, but if we're not going to do it, we're not going to get these state dollars. So I think it really is going to help with trying to figure out, what works, what doesn't work. What kind of things have we done that have served their purpose? One of the things that's really hard for people in government to do is to realize that certain ideas, some policies do have life expectancies. They run for a while, but the world changes and you have to be able to adjust and adapt your policy to that. And what government is really not good at, as we've talked about earlier when it comes to programs, government's really not good at recognizing and acknowledging that the world has changed and we need to change with it. And so by making some of this stuff more available, making in all areas, not just in education, in all areas, probably the biggest changing area that we're going to see over the next decade is in healthcare. The way we deliver healthcare today, the roles that states play and the way we deliver healthcare is going to be dramatically different as artificial intelligence and other technologies start to work their way into the healthcare system. We have to make our policies and the things that we're doing adjust to those kind of technological changes because the private sector is going to innovate and it's going to change, and government has to catch up and kind of stay with it if we're going to have programs that work effectively.
And you mentioned healthcare. A couple episodes ago, we interviewed Representative Dan Howell, and I know he talked about the healthcare transparency law that you both worked on. I believe that you were the Senate sponsor of that bill, and we did a deep dive on it. So I definitely want to stick with education for this conversation and move to the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. But that was another effort from you both regarding transparency and to your point about healthcare. I know y'all are going to probably take another bite at that apple next year, but I encourage everybody to listen to that episode. They could hear all about that bill.
Yeah, Dan, I'm sure Dan did a great job. He's very well media trained. He spent years on television, so he's a great interview. But as I said earlier, the two biggest expenditures that we have are education and health, and so it makes sense that folks like Dan, folks like me, we'd be talking about those two particular things because that's where taxpayers spend a lot of their dollars.
Absolutely. And, you can't talk about transparency without talking about accountability. So accountability extends beyond funding and into governance itself. This session, you also sponsored legislation SB 2079 involving the Tennessee Higher Education Commission and broader questions around governance and oversight in higher education. So why is governance structure important when states think about long-term outcomes and institutional accountability?
One of the things that we do here in Tennessee, and I'm sure a lot of other states do, but we do it really, really well, is we have and I was chairman of this committee for a number of years, Government Operations Committee, which has the responsibility for reviewing every board, commission, agency that the state of Tennessee has. And we tend to put sunsets, as we talked about pieces of legislation, we put specific sunsets on all these different sort of oversight organizations in order to force legislatures to re-examine them before they just simply renew them. Under the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, we thought that it was time to take a fresh look at what they do, take a fresh look at how they're appointed, take a fresh look at who appoints them, and take a fresh look at perhaps we need new faces again to address a changing the world. The world of higher education today is a lot different than it was 25 years ago, a lot different than it was even 10 years ago. And we need to constantly challenge oversight to not only monitor how well we're doing in the new framework, but also to be sure that our governing system is capable of having oversight in the world as it has changed before us. And nowhere is that more true than in higher education.
And how do you strike the right balance between accountability and oversight on one hand, while still allowing institutions enough flexibility to innovate and meet local needs?
I think the accountability is the big piece of that, is that once you put in place legislative policy, which becomes a law, then you have to allow the local entity or whoever the entity is that's responsible for executing the law, allow them the opportunity to execute the law as it's been written, and then hold them accountable to those results. Again, that's easy to talk about. Everybody talks about it. It's hard to do because you do have to be willing to say an idea that you had didn't work, or the people who are assigned with executing it are not capable of doing it or haven't done it in a way that that the legislature or the governor intended, and hold those people accountable. And that's really difficult to do in a political system. Again, by having a sunset requirement, it sort of forces the oversight, in this case, in the Senate, the Government Operations Committee, it forces them to ask those hard questions. Yeah. Are you doing what the law or what we intended you to do? Are you the right people to be doing what we had intended to do? Are there suggestions and recommendations that you would have to help us execute this more clearly? Or is this something that simply because it's now being sunset, it needs to go away?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Tennessee's had quite the reform journey. So y'all have implemented a number of significant policy reforms over the past decade. So we might have to go back into the Rolodex a little bit, particularly in education and government accountability, as we've talked about today. You've had a focus. But when Tennessee undertakes major reforms, what does success look like beyond simply passing the legislation? What's been your experience?
Well, it's a little bit subjective. I mean, you can do objective stuff. You know, sure. You can say under the education world, you can say, well, we're going to see, improvement in reading scores, or we're going to see improvement in math scores. We're going to see better less retention, third grade retention, because third graders are reading better and they're moving on to the fourth grade. Or we're going to see fewer students drop out of school in the 9th and 10th grade because we've improved our literacy to where, students no longer get frustrated and just kind of give up. Or we've seen where students are taking advantage of career readiness rather than everything being focused at students going to college. We create an environment where, there's the option for students to go to a traditional college, but we've also created pathways where students who want to learn some other way in the trades or whatever we see students being successful there. We see all those kind of things. But at the end of the day, it's a more subjective question of, are we making it better? Are we creating more opportunities for Tennesseans to be successful in whatever way they define success? Are we in the education space? I would say, are we creating pathways by which students and their families can find the path that is best for them? That's why, we've done so much reform around charter schools, traditional public schools, magnet schools, academies, homeschooling, virtual schooling, school choice. I mean, we have all those options because we're trying to create paths for parents and students to find the way that works best for them. So I would say, in the subjective way, are we hearing back from our constituents that they value the many options that are created for them in the education space? And are they turning those options into career choices, life choices that are making things better for them in Tennessee, and in doing so, making things better all across Tennessee? That's a long answer.
Oh, it's great.
But it really is a sense of, is Tennessee creating great opportunities for Tennesseans? And I think we are.
And you just rolled through several large-scale policy reforms that Tennessee has tackled, and that's just in the education space. So you all have tackled a lot of reforms in a lot of other spaces as well. And some of the things that you mentioned, from school choice to improving literacy and math rates among kids. We've seen several southern states take that on recently, particularly in literacy in the last several years. So looking back, what has Tennessee learned about implementing large-scale policy changes that might benefit other states considering similar reforms?
It's hard.
Yeah, buckle up.
It really is. It really is hard. I mean, none of us like change. We just don't. I mean, it's like we don't like to change the shoes that we're wearing. We like the shoes that we're wearing, right?
Yeah, we've broken them in.
Change is really hard. The other thing is, and we talked about this earlier in the podcast, is that change is really hard at the legislative level because the legislature changes. Yeah. And, we get elected by a constituency that has certain hopes, dreams, and visions for the community that we represent. And what do you do when you've got these really big reforms that are occurring, and then you start getting people who are elected who are against all those reforms?
Yeah.
And they're having great results, but you now see the public kind of pushing back on that. How do you stay focused on that? And that's, when you asked me earlier about one of the challenges, that's the challenge. You can write on a piece of paper, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to go from this point to this point. The problem is keeping a legislative agenda consistent to get you to those 2 points is really challenging. And again, I said earlier, we've been really lucky in Tennessee that we've had a cohesive group of legislators in both the House and the Senate. And we've had legislative leadership in the House and the Senate that has aligned itself very well with each other and has aligned itself with the two most recent governors. And we've been able to make these reforms, and we've been able to make them stick because we've been consistent in it. Other states, if parties are constantly changing, governors are constantly changing, it's much more difficult to achieve some of those kind of results.
And you make a great point, because obviously I cover 15 states, so I get to see the landscape happening and the uniqueness happening in each state. That is something about Tennessee that stands out, is the House, the Senate, and the governor seem to be pretty aligned. And that has proven to be very helpful for you all. And not all states are we seeing that alignment. We might see it in the House and Senate, but maybe not the executive branch, or even between House and Senate. Sometimes there's not agreement. So that has really makes a huge difference in a state.
Well, I don't care if you're in government or you're in the nonprofit sector or if you're in the private sector, getting alignment between the different levels is really, really critical. So having alignment, of course, between legislative branches and the federal and the executive branch and state government is really important, but also having alignment with our federal partners and then having alignment with our local partners, because ultimately, the workhorses of our system of government in the United States, the workhorses are state governments. They are the workhorses.
Yeah.
And we have to really have close alignment to our partners at the local level, because it is our local government who carries out most of the policies that the state puts in place. The federal government, in reality, has very little domestic influence. The Constitution doesn't allow them to really do a lot of the things that they do. They only do those things because the states allow them to do it, particularly in like the education space. A few years ago, I guess about 2 years ago, we embarked on just a conversation in Tennessee about, what if we decided not to take any federal dollars? What would that look like, right? What would that mean? Now, of course, there was outrage and concern expressed all across the state, but it was somewhat of an intellectual exercise to kind of say, because we're doing these things not because we have to, we're doing them because we're choosing to, because the federal government's choosing to fund them. What would it look like if we didn't do that?
Yeah.
And there are a number of areas, all across state government where the state government does it because we're choosing to do it. But the federal government doesn't have as much influence on the day-to-day lives as people might think. But the local government does. And so that's why there really needs to be good alignment between what's happening at the state level and what's happening in our local governments.
Absolutely. And to get these major reforms passed, that alignment is critical in what you're doing. As you mentioned, it could take a decade to get some of that really going for you to see the results and to really know if it is working or not. So thank you for your work on that, because you said it's hard. You got to buckle up and really dig in and do the work. So that is imperative. Senator, you've spent much of our conversation discussing policy, accountability, how states measure success. And before we close, I'd like to switch gears and ask for a few quick fire questions. What's one thing people often misunderstand about state government?
Well, we're often the forgotten level of government, and yet we are the most important piece of government in our system. State governments have to do things. We have to execute policies. We have to try and govern. It's not optional. And so I think one of the things that people don't realize is how much and how critical state government is to their daily lives.
Yes, y'all have to be effective, right? There's no question about it. So,
well, I don't know whether we're effective, but you have to be active. You don't get to do continuing resolutions and things like that. You have to make decisions. In Tennessee and in most states, you have to pass a budget. I mean, our Constitution requires that one bill be passed every year, and that's the budget bill. That's the only bill we ever really have to do. It is the most important thing that we do, but we don't get the option of not doing it. We have to do it. And again, states carry out much of the work that gets done all across the United States. It's the state governments that's doing the heavy lifting.
What's one policy area you think deserves more attention than it's currently receiving?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it goes, state by state. Infrastructure gets a lot of attention, and it needs to get a lot of attention. I think probably for us in Tennessee, we need to pay more attention in the child care space, and I think we're going to be doing that over the next couple of years. The federal government has done a lot in that space, but state governments haven't done as much. I think because of the financial pressure that the federal government is now experiencing, and they're now pushing a lot of things back down to the state level where it probably should have been in the first place. I think states are going to have to think creatively about childcare and how we can, and for a state like Tennessee, how we can conservatively be partners with our families and help. Because it's getting incredibly expensive for families, particularly our middle class families. The wealthy can provide for themselves. The poor have any number of programs that the government provides for them, but they're stuck in the middle as the hardworking middle class folks that often are left out. And we're trying to look at some ways within childcare that we can help those families because they're critical to our system. So I'd say childcare probably needs more attention.
Well, let's meet next year and talk about childcare.
Well, I had a really good bill this year about that was passed and became law, which creates a program where the employer, the state, and the employee will share in the cost of childcare, which I think is going to be really effective.
What's the most valuable lesson you've learned during your time in public service?
This is hard work. And I guess the most valuable lesson is that once you pass a law, even a really good idea becomes law. It takes time for it to actually get communicated to everyone, and for everyone to start executing what the law requires. And so patience is a really important virtue here. Making the right decision, and then sticking to that decision and having the patience to allow the decision to go into effect and get worked out. Mass communication is very challenging. So when you come up with really good reform ideas, it's going to take a few years for it to have its effect.
That's a good one. What challenge do you think states across the South will be grappling with over the next decade, regardless of geography or political differences?
It's going to be financial. Look, we've been talking about for decades now the financial challenges that our federal government faces. And at some point, and I believe we're kind of approaching that inflection point where that they simply have to make hard decisions. And, regardless of what one feels politically or from a partisan perspective about the current administration, They are recognizing the fact that some of the things that the federal government is doing is not the job of the federal government. It's the job of the states. And they're pushing those responsibilities down to the states. They're sending some funding with it, but not to the same degree that the states might have been used to. And states are going to have to make the hard decisions of, are we going to continue to do this or are we not? A perfect example for Tennessee, and I guess virtually every state is, we got a lot of COVID money a few years ago that allowed us to do a lot of things, but that money has run out. And states are having to decide, do we want to continue to pay for this or do we not want to continue to pay for this? Since the public doesn't really make a distinction between state or federal government, states are going to have to spend a lot of time explaining to people why we have chosen not to do something that they may have become accustomed to. But I think the biggest challenge for the states in the next decade is going to be financially managing some of the things that the federal government simply cannot afford to do anymore.
And then when you think about the future of Tennessee, what gives you the most optimism?
Well, it's a great place to live.
Yeah.
I've never lived anywhere else outside the boundaries of the state of Tennessee. Heck, I've never lived outside of East Tennessee. I guess some people might consider that a flaw. Look, I think we the southern states in general are coming into their own. Mm-hmm. The trick for us and the challenge I'm really optimistic about Tennessee. We've just got, we've got a lot of things going for us. We've created an environment, like we talked about earlier, where I think we're creating opportunities where people can be successful to the degree that they want to define success. But the challenge for us is to absorb all that success without changing who we are as a community. And that's difficult. But I think we're trying to manage our way through that as we're experiencing growth in a lot of different areas. We're trying to manage it in what some would say is the Tennessee way. But I'm really, the progress that we have made in education really demonstrates that we've got a lot of good days ahead of us. The other thing that I'm really proud about is that the southern states, and I'll say particularly Tennessee, we're really beginning to grow in our own confidence in ourselves. Yeah. That we are capable of doing many things. For so long, the Midwest was considered to be, the manufacturing area, the Rust Belt, and nobody else could do it. And now we realize, heck, you can go to the South and advanced manufacturing and automobiles can be done really efficiently and effectively in a state like Tennessee. And oh, by the way, they have a really well-educated workforce that's capable of doing on that. In the academic world, for a long time, everybody looked at the Northeast, and that's where all the brains are. And if you got a problem, you need to call somebody from Boston to come in and fix your problem for you. Well, now a lot of those states are looking at states like Tennessee saying, those guys have figured out, heck, they're looking at Mississippi and saying, those guys have figured out how to advance literacy in one of the more challenging states for literacy. So I think our confidence, we're starting to build confidence, which is really important to be successful long term, is to be confident about what you're doing and the decisions that you're making. And I'm really proud of Tennessee that as a community, we're gaining in confidence, and that means that we will gain in success. Yeah.
We've got a grit like no other in the South, don't we?
Well, sometimes it serves us well and sometimes maybe not. I tell people all the time, that are from other parts, either other parts of the country or either other parts of the world, that, if you come particularly East Tennessee, where most of us are Appalachian of some sort, don't tell us that we have to do something. You might suggest something to us and we'll do it. But if you tell us that we have to do it, then good luck.
That's right. Well, you live in a beautiful part of Tennessee. I believe you're in the Chattanooga area.
I am.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Well, as we close, I'll end with a question we ask all of our guests. So what is the best piece of professional advice you have ever received, and how does it shape the way you approach leadership today? Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm going to say my dad gave it to me. And I would encourage other legislators to listen to my dad. And it's probably, my dad was a businessman, so it's probably some old business adage that he picked up along the way. But it's keep the main thing the main thing. In the legislative world, we will deal with
hundreds of bills, and it's easy to get distracted on the little things. And sometimes, as Lamar Alexander has famously said, don't be surprised when the little thing doesn't become the big thing. But when we've spent a lot of time talking about strategy and governance and those kind of things. If you're truly committed to improving K-12 education, then you have to stay focused because it is hard work. You have to stay focused on that. And in the legislative world, that kind of focus, as we've discussed, is really difficult. But in K-12 education, if you think about the main thing, what's the main thing? The main thing is not the teachers. The main thing is not the buildings or the infrastructure. The main thing is the children that you're trying to educate. When you keep your thought on the main thing, then you start to make policy decisions that have the proper impact that you want it to have. And I feel like in many ways we've done that. And then I'm going to give you a bonus. That's another one of my dad's great sayings. And that is, when all is said and done, more's been said than done. And I think that's very true for legislators to realize, is that because there are an abundance of things that we will deal with, there will be a lot of talk about a lot of things. But again, only a few things will get actually done. You want those things that get done to be the things that you're really trying to focus on that will lead to your overall success in whatever way you're trying to be successful.
I love that. I will take those with me. You may hear me say, keep the main thing from now on. So I will take your father's advice as well. That's great advice. So thank you for sharing that, bestowing that on us today. Senator Watson, thank you for joining us and for sharing your perspective on leadership accountability and the important work of turning policy into meaningful results for Tennesseans. We also appreciate your many years of public service and your continued commitment to thoughtful governance and responsible stewardship of public resources. I also know you serve on the CSG National Executive Committee, so thank you so much for the work that you're doing on that committee and for our organization as well.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me. It's been great.
Of course, it's been wonderful. We will meet again on a new policy. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Real Estate. For more conversations like this and more about the work of CSG South, visit csgsouth.org. I'm Lindsey Gray. Let's keep it real.
Thank you for joining us today on Real Estate, where we keep it real about what really matters.